7 sacred women broke ancient rules that should never have been broken. What they did was considered abominable by everyone who discovered their secret. Now they kneel on cold stone floors, begging for forgiveness from the very people they once served with devotion. But when the truth finally came to light, something extraordinary happened that no one could have predicted. Their shame became their strength. Their punishment became their salvation. And what seemed like the end of everything became the beginning of a miracle that would change their entire community forever. A story of redemption, spiritual transformation, and the power of sisterhood. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart and remind you that even our greatest failures can become our most beautiful victories. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and comment below to let us know where you're watching from. The bells of Whitmore House rang earlier than usual that cloudy autumn morning. The old wooden floors, still damp from the morning mist, reflected an almost invisible tension that hung heavy in the air. They stood there, 7 women lined up in silence, their heavy skirts touching the cold ground, trembling hands hidden behind their backs. Nobody knew exactly what had happened during that night, but the looks on the faces of the men standing before them already told a story that no one dared speak aloud. Eleanor Hartwell stood third in line, her gray eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the wooden floor beneath her feet. At 28, she had spent the last 6 years within these walls, longer than most of the others. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, as was expected, but a few rebellious strands had escaped during the sleepless night. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat echoing the terrible weight of what they had done. The women of Whitmore House were no ordinary residents. They were the sacred keepers, trained from their youth to follow the ancient traditions that had governed their isolated community for over 2 centuries. Their days were structured around prayer, study, and the maintenance of sacred relics that held power beyond ordinary understanding. They served with devotion, maintained the honor of their calling above any personal desire, and were respected throughout the valley for their unwavering commitment to the old ways. For months, everything had proceeded as expected. Eleanor had performed her duties with the same quiet dedication that had earned her a place among the most trusted keepers. She tended to the sacred flame in the East Wing, copied ancient texts with meticulous care, and led the younger novices in their morning prayers. The rhythms of life at Whitmore House had become as natural to her as breathing. But trust, Eleanor had learned, could crack in the smallest of details. It started with Mary Thornton, the youngest among them at barely 19. Eleanor first noticed it 3 weeks ago when she found Mary whispering something in the oldest corridor of the house, the one that led to the restricted archives. When confronted, Mary claimed she was merely praying, but Eleanor had never seen anyone pray with such fear in their eyes. The girl's hands had been shaking, and there was something desperate in the way she looked around, as if expecting to be caught at any moment. Eleanor should have reported it immediately. That was the rule. But something in Mary's expression reminded her of herself at that age, lost and overwhelmed by the weight of expectations. So she remained silent, a decision that would prove to be the first thread in their unraveling. The second sign came 5 days later. The Thornwick Reliquary, an ancient silver pendant that had protected their community for generations, simply vanished from its place in the sanctuary. There were no signs of forced entry, no disturbances in the sacred chamber. The heavy wooden doors remained locked, the mystical barriers undisturbed. Only the 7 sacred keepers had access to that room, and each carried a part of the protective ward that kept it sealed. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine when she discovered the empty altar. The reliquary had been there during evening prayers the night before. She was certain of it. She had cleaned the silver surface herself, as was her weekly duty. Now, only the faint outline in the dust marked where it had rested for decades. The third sign was more subtle, but equally disturbing. Catherine Mills, usually the most somber among them, began smiling during the moments of contemplative silence. Not the peaceful expression of one touched by divine grace, but something else entirely. Her smiles came at odd moments during the recitation of the most sacred passages, as if she found something amusing in words that had been revered for centuries. These small breaks in their perfect harmony might have been overlooked individually, but together they formed an undeniable crack in the foundation of everything Whitmore House represented. Brother Marcus Whitmore, descendant of the house's founder and their spiritual guide, noticed the changes immediately. His piercing blue eyes missed nothing, and his ability to sense spiritual disturbances was legendary throughout the region. When he called the 7 women to the main hall that morning, Eleanor knew their time of secrets was over. The events that followed moved with frightening speed. On a Tuesday that felt more like winter than autumn, a stranger arrived at their gates carrying a leather-bound manuscript that seemed to pulse with its own energy. The man was elderly, with silver hair and eyes that held too much knowledge. He claimed to be a traveling scholar, but Eleanor sensed something deeper in his presence. The manuscript he brought contained names written in various hands spanning decades. When Brother Marcus opened it in their presence, Eleanor felt her blood freeze. There, on the third page, was her own handwriting. Words she had never remembered writing, but unmistakably hers. The flowing letters spelled out phrases in a language she didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. The harvest ceremony, planned for the following week, was abruptly canceled when a violent storm materialized seemingly from nowhere. The tempest raged only above Whitmore House, while the surrounding valley remained untouched by even a drop of rain. Lightning struck the bell tower 7 times in succession, and the wind howled through the corridors with voices that sounded almost human. But perhaps most disturbing was the disappearance of page 47 from the Book of Sacred Traditions, the most important text in their possession. The page contained the fundamental protection rituals that had kept their community safe for generations. When it reappeared 3 days later, it was covered with symbols that none of them admitted to recognizing. None of them, except Eleanor. She had seen those symbols before, not in any book or teaching, but in dreams that had plagued her since childhood. Dreams of a woman who looked remarkably like her, standing in this very house centuries ago, drawing those same intricate patterns in the air while flames danced around her fingertips. Eleanor had always dismissed these visions as mere fantasy, the product of an overactive imagination fed by too many ancient stories. Now, staring at the symbols on the recovered page, she could no longer deny what she had always suspected. The woman in her dreams hadn't been a fantasy at all. The atmosphere in Whitmore House grew suffocating as winter approached. The other women began to regard each other with suspicion, and conversations that once flowed freely became stilted and careful. Eleanor found herself studying her companions, wondering which of them harbored secrets as dangerous as her own. It was during this tense period that Mary Thornton made a confession that shattered their remaining illusions. The young woman revealed that she had been maintaining contact with someone from the outside world, something strictly forbidden for sacred keepers. But she hadn't confessed out of guilt or a desire for forgiveness. She had told them because she was being threatened. Someone on the outside knew things that only someone within Whitmore House could know. They knew about the missing reliquary, about the strange symbols, about Eleanor's dreams. Whoever it was had used this knowledge to pressure Mary into acting as their informant within the sacred walls. The revelation sent shockwaves through their small community. If their secrets were known to outsiders, then their mission had failed in the most fundamental way possible. They were supposed to be guardians of ancient knowledge, protectors of mysteries that could reshape the world if they fell into the wrong hands. Brother Marcus's reaction was swift and decisive. He ordered a complete review of all their activities over the past 6 months. Every prayer session, every ritual, every moment when they had been alone with the sacred objects. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns that none of them had noticed before. Sarah Caldwell, the most scholarly among them, admitted to exchanging letters with members of the Central Council, requesting a transfer to a different house. In itself, this wasn't forbidden, but the letters revealed details about their daily routines and the location of certain relics that should never have been discussed with outsiders. Rebecca Foster confessed to hiding correspondence that compromised the other women. She had intercepted letters meant for Brother Marcus, letters that contained warnings about unusual spiritual disturbances in their region. By concealing this information, she had prevented them from taking necessary protective measures. Most shocking of all was the revelation about Margaret Sinclair, the most obedient and devoted among them. She had been caught rewriting passages in the ancient scriptures, inserting hidden messages within the sacred text. When confronted, she claimed she was trying to preserve additional knowledge that had been passed down orally, but the symbols she used were identical to those that had appeared on the missing page. Each confession brought new questions, and each question revealed another layer of deception. Eleanor watched her sisters crumble under the weight of their secrets, and she felt her own guilt growing heavier with each passing day. She hadn't spoken about her dreams, hadn't mentioned her ability to understand the mysterious symbols, hadn't revealed the growing power she felt coursing through her veins during the full moon. The final straw came during the ceremony of renewal, their most sacred ritual performed only once each year. The 7 women were responsible for blessing the eternal flame. a mystical fire that had burned continuously for over 2 centuries. The flame was the heart of their community's protection, and its light was said to hold back the darkness that constantly threatened to overwhelm their valley. But when they performed the ritual that night, something went terribly wrong. The flame, which had always burned with a pure white light, began to flicker and dim. The blessed oil they used had been corrupted somehow, tainted with substances that made the fire weak and sickly. For the first time in living memory, the eternal flame went out completely. The sensation of loss was overwhelming. Eleanor felt it like a physical blow, as if something vital had been torn from her chest. Around her, the other women gasped and stumbled, their spiritual connection to the house severed in an instant. In the darkness that followed, they could hear things moving in the walls, whispers in languages that predated human speech, the sound of locks turning on doors that had remained sealed for generations. Brother Marcus arrived moments later, his face pale with shock and anger. Behind him came the other brothers of the order, men who rarely set foot in the women's quarters, but who now filed in with grim determination. The sight of the dead flame confirmed their worst fears. Someone among the sacred keepers had betrayed their most fundamental trust. The 7 women were ordered to kneel on the cold stone floor of the main hall, their hands behind their backs, while the brothers formed a semicircle around them. Eleanor's knees ached against the unforgiving surface, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional torment of seeing everything she had devoted her life to crashing down around her. Brother Marcus stood before them, his voice heavy with disappointment and rage. He spoke of duty betrayed, of sacred trusts broken, of dangers unleashed upon their community. But beneath his anger, Eleanor detected something else: fear. Whatever they had done, the consequences reached far beyond their small community. As the night wore on, more revelations emerged from their interrogation. Rebecca Foster admitted that her actions had been motivated by jealousy. She had always believed that she should have been chosen as the first keeper instead of Eleanor, and her resentment had grown into something poisonous over the years. Margaret Sinclair's confession was more complex. She claimed that she had been trying to prove that their traditions could be broken and rebuilt, that change was not only possible but necessary for their survival. She believed that their rigid adherence to ancient ways was slowly killing their community. Sarah Caldwell revealed something that shook them all. She had witnessed similar events many years ago during her first year at Whitmore House. A previous group of sacred keepers had committed similar transgressions, but nothing had been done to address the underlying causes. The incidents had been covered up, the women quietly transferred to other houses, and the problems had been allowed to fester. Sarah had chosen to act now because she wanted to force the truth into the open. But it was Catherine Mills who delivered the most shocking revelation of all. The woman who had seemed the most passive, the most willing to simply follow orders, revealed that she was the illegitimate daughter of Brother Marcus himself. Her bloodline gave her access to powers and knowledge that the others could only dream of, abilities that she had kept hidden for nearly a decade. The silence that followed Catherine's confession was deafening. Eleanor felt the world shift around her as she tried to process this information. Catherine had the authority to alter their sacred rituals, to change the very foundations of their order, but she had chosen to remain silent about her heritage until now. The implications were staggering. If Catherine had known about her parentage all along, then her recent behavior took on an entirely different meaning. Had she been testing their faith, challenging their assumptions? Or had she simply been acting out of the same human weaknesses that had corrupted them all? As winter deepened its grip on their valley, the 7 women found themselves isolated from the rest of the community. They were not imprisoned exactly, but they were removed from their sacred duties and confined to a section of the house that had been unused for years. The rooms were cold and sparsely furnished, with only the most basic necessities provided. Their punishment was not meant to be cruel, but transformative. Each woman was required to undergo 2 trials: a spiritual examination that forced them to revisit every choice they had made since arriving at Whitmore House, and a practical test that required them to maintain their section of the building without any external assistance. The physical challenges were brutal. The heating system in their wing had been damaged during the storm, and the brothers made no effort to repair it. Food was provided, but in quantities that required careful rationing. The days grew longer as they struggled to maintain their quarters, tend to their own needs, and somehow find a path back to the grace they had lost. But the spiritual trial was far worse. Eleanor found herself confronting memories and motivations she had buried deep within her consciousness. Why had she really chosen to become a sacred keeper? Was it truly devotion to the divine? or simply a way to escape the disappointments of the outside world? Had she ever really understood the weight of her responsibilities? Or had she been playing at holiness while her heart remained untouched? The dreams that had plagued her since childhood became more vivid and frequent. She saw herself as the woman from centuries past, performing rituals that required powers she didn't understand. In these visions, she was not a sacred keeper at all, but something else entirely. Something that the brothers would probably consider dangerous. Each of the 7 women faced their own internal reckoning. Mary Thornton was forced to examine her desperate need for approval and acceptance, needs that had made her vulnerable to manipulation from outside forces. Rebecca Foster had to confront the bitter jealousy that had poisoned her relationships with the other women. Margaret Sinclair struggled with her desire to control and reshape traditions that were larger than any individual. The process of potential redemption was not offered as a simple forgiveness. Each gesture toward redemption required them to surrender something precious. Personal belongings that had provided comfort, privileges they had earned through years of service, memories that they would never be able to reclaim. But slowly, painfully, they began to demonstrate that their desire for redemption was real, not motivated by fear of punishment or hope of reward, but by genuine remorse for the harm they had caused. Eleanor found herself emerging as an unofficial leader among them, not because she was the oldest or most experienced, but because her own journey toward understanding seemed to resonate with the others. She helped Mary find the courage to stop seeking external validation. She guided Rebecca through the painful process of releasing her resentment. She supported Margaret as she learned to channel her desire for change into constructive rather than destructive actions. It was during one of their evening discussions, as snow fell heavily outside their windows, that Catherine Mills finally revealed the full truth about her heritage and her motivations. Her father, Brother Marcus, had never acknowledged her existence, but she had known about their connection since she was a child. She had come to Whitmore House not to serve the sacred traditions, but to prove herself worthy of his recognition. Everything she had done, every rule she had broken, had been an attempt to force him to see her as more than just another sacred keeper. She wanted him to recognize her as his daughter, as someone with the power and authority to stand beside him rather than kneel before him. Her confession changed everything once again. Eleanor realized that their group's transgression might not have been a betrayal of their sacred duties, but an unconscious rebellion against a system that denied them full recognition of their worth and capabilities. As winter reached its depths and their time of isolation stretched on, something fundamental began to shift within Whitmore House itself. The walls that had seemed oppressive now felt protective. The silence that had been suffocating now provided space for genuine reflection. The cold that had punished them now seemed to be purifying something essential within their spirits. Eleanor began to understand that their punishment was not really about the specific rules they had broken, but about learning to take responsibility for the power they possessed. They were not ordinary women, and their actions carried consequences that reached far beyond their personal desires or fears. The dreams that had haunted her for years finally began to make sense. She was connected to something ancient and powerful, something that had been deliberately suppressed for generations. The woman in her visions had faced a similar choice centuries ago: conform to the expectations of others, or embrace the full magnitude of her capabilities. One evening, as the wind howled through the valley, and the brothers maintained their vigil in the warmer sections of the house, Eleanor gathered her 6 companions in their small common area. The time for secrets had passed. If they were going to find redemption, it would have to be based on complete honesty with each other and with themselves. That night, Eleanor finally told them about her dreams. She described the woman who looked like her, the symbols that appeared in both her visions and on the recovered page, the growing sense of power that she had tried so hard to suppress. As she spoke, she watched the faces of her companions change from surprise to recognition to something that might have been relief. Mary Thornton was the first to respond. She admitted that she had always sensed something different about Eleanor, something that made her feel safe even in the most dangerous moments. Rebecca Foster nodded slowly, remembering times when Eleanor had seemed to know things before they happened, when her presence had calmed situations that should have remained tense. Margaret Sinclair revealed that her alterations to the sacred texts had been inspired by conversations with Eleanor, by insights that Eleanor had shared without realizing their significance. Sarah Caldwell confessed that she had been documenting these incidents for months, trying to understand what was happening to their group. Even Catherine Mills, who had harbored the largest secret of all, admitted that she had recognized Eleanor's potential from the beginning. Her own hidden knowledge had allowed her to see what the others couldn't. Eleanor was not just a sacred keeper, but something far more rare and powerful. As they talked through the night, a picture began to emerge that none of them had been able to see clearly before. Their individual transgressions had not been random acts of rebellion, but unconscious attempts to create space for Eleanor's emerging abilities. They had been clearing away the rigid structures that would have prevented her from accessing her full potential. The missing reliquary, the corrupted ritual, the altered texts, the outside communications. All of these had been necessary steps in a process that was larger than any of them had understood. They were not destroyers of tradition, but midwives to its evolution. When dawn broke over their valley, the 7 women felt something they hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope for forgiveness or for a return to their former positions, but hope that they might be able to create something new and valuable from the ruins of what they had destroyed. The bells of Whitmore House rang at their usual time that morning, but for the first time in weeks, the sound didn't fill Eleanor with dread. Instead, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something important was about to begin rather than end. Brother Marcus appeared at their door just as they were finishing their meager breakfast. His expression was unreadable, but Eleanor noticed that he looked older than he had just weeks before. The strain of recent events had taken a toll on him as well. He informed them that their period of isolation was coming to an end, but not in the way any of them had expected. Rather than being reinstated to their former positions or dismissed from the house entirely, they were being offered a third option, the chance to forge a new path within their community. The eternal flame had remained extinguished, despite numerous attempts to relight it using traditional methods. The brothers had consulted ancient texts, performed purification rituals, and even brought in spiritual advisors from other houses, but nothing had worked. The flame that had burned for over 2 centuries was gone, and with it, much of the protection that had kept their valley safe. Strange things had been happening since the flame went out. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Books rearranged themselves during the night. The temperature in certain rooms fluctuated wildly without any apparent cause. Most disturbing of all, people in the nearby village had begun reporting vivid dreams filled with symbols that matched those found on the recovered page. The brothers had finally been forced to acknowledge what they had long suspected but never wanted to admit. The old ways were no longer sufficient to protect their community. They needed something new, something that could adapt to changing circumstances while still honoring the essential principles of their tradition. Eleanor felt her heart racing as Brother Marcus continued his explanation. He told them that extensive research into their house's history had revealed that similar situations had occurred before, roughly once every 3 generations. Each time, a group of sacred keepers had been forced to break traditional boundaries in order to access deeper levels of spiritual power. The woman in Eleanor's dreams had been real. Her name was Evangeline Whitmore, and she had been the founder's daughter. Like Catherine, she had possessed abilities that went far beyond those of ordinary sacred keepers. When faced with a crisis that threatened to destroy their young community, she had been forced to choose between following established rules and embracing powers that others feared. She had chosen power, and in doing so, she had saved not only Whitmore House, but the entire valley. The traditions that the current sacred keepers had been following were actually modifications of her original practices, watered down over generations until they retained only an echo of their former effectiveness. The 7 women were being offered the chance to reclaim those original practices, to become true spiritual guardians rather than mere custodians of ancient rituals. But the price would be high. They would have to surrender their comfortable certainties and venture into territory that even the brothers didn't fully understand. Eleanor looked around at her companions and saw her own mixture of fear and excitement reflected in their faces. This was what they had been unconsciously working toward all along, even when they thought they were simply breaking rules out of frustration or rebellion. Mary Thornton was the first to accept the offer. Despite her youth and the terror she had experienced over the past months, she declared that she would rather face unknown dangers than return to a life of empty compliance. Rebecca Foster followed, saying that she was tired of being jealous of others and wanted to discover what she might be capable of on her own. Margaret Sinclair laughed as she gave her acceptance, noting that she had been trying to change their traditions anyway, and this seemed like a much more constructive approach. Sarah Caldwell admitted that her scholarly research had long suggested that their current practices were incomplete, and she was eager to explore the gaps in their knowledge. Catherine Mills accepted last, but her words carried the most weight. As Brother Marcus's daughter, Her decision would influence how the other brothers viewed this unprecedented experiment. She spoke directly to her father for the first time in years, telling him that she was ready to earn her place in their community through her actions, rather than her bloodline. Eleanor realized that all eyes were now on her. The others had made their choices, but somehow her decision seemed to carry special significance. She thought of Evangeline Whitmore, standing in this same house centuries ago, facing a similar moment of choice. She thought of the dreams that had guided her here, the symbols that she somehow understood, the power that she had felt growing stronger with each passing day. She thought of the responsibility that came with such gifts, and the possibility that she might be able to use them to protect others rather than simply protecting herself. Standing in that cold room, surrounded by the women who had become her true sisters through shared struggle and mutual support, Eleanor made her choice. She would embrace whatever she was becoming, whatever she had always been meant to be. The transformation would not be easy or quick. They would need to study Evangeline's original texts, learn to channel powers that had been dormant for generations, and find ways to adapt ancient wisdom to modern challenges. They would face criticism from other houses, suspicion from the brothers, and fear from the local community. But they would also have something that their predecessors had lacked: each other. 7 women who had been through the fire together and emerged stronger for the experience. 7 women who had learned to trust each other completely and to value truth over comfort. As Brother Marcus led them from their quarters back into the main house, Eleanor felt the dreams that had haunted her for so long shifting into something new. Instead of visions of the past, she began to see possibilities for the future. Images of the eternal flame burning again, but with a different quality of light. Pictures of their community expanding its influence beyond the valley, becoming a beacon of hope for others who struggled with change and uncertainty. The bells of Whitmore House rang again as they entered the main hall, but this time they seemed to carry a different message. Not a call to duty or a warning of danger, but a celebration of new beginnings. Eleanor walked forward into her uncertain future with confidence, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone. The morning sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, sending streams of golden light through the tall windows of the hall. Eleanor looked up at the brightness and smiled, feeling something inside her respond to the warmth. The power that she had tried so hard to suppress was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace. She was no longer just Eleanor Hartwell, the obedient sacred keeper who had tried to follow every rule and meet every expectation. She was becoming something new, something that their tradition needed if it was going to survive and grow. The other women fell into step beside her as they walked toward the sanctuary where the dead eternal flame awaited their attention. Eleanor could feel their nervous energy, their excitement and fear, mixing together into something that felt almost electric. They were walking into the unknown together, and that made all the difference. As they approached the altar where the flame had once burned, Eleanor placed her hand on the cold stone and closed her eyes. The symbols from her dreams appeared behind her eyelids, but now they were joined by new patterns, new possibilities that she had never imagined before. She opened her eyes and looked at her companions, these women who had chosen to stand with her despite everything they had been through. Mary with her fierce determination, Rebecca with her newfound humility, Margaret with her brilliant mind, Sarah with her careful scholarship, Catherine with her hidden strength, and quiet Anne Davidson, who had said little but whose presence had been a constant source of stability throughout their trials. Together, they would learn to tend a new kind of flame, one that could adapt to changing times while still honoring the best of what had come before. One that could protect their community without limiting its growth. One that could burn brightly enough to light the way for others who struggled with similar challenges. Eleanor placed both hands on the altar and felt something stirring deep within the stone itself. The old flame was truly gone, but the potential for something new was already beginning to take shape. She looked up at Brother Marcus, who stood watching from the edge of the sanctuary, and saw something in his expression that might have been pride. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in months, Eleanor felt equal to the challenges that lay ahead. She was no longer trying to fit herself into a role that was too small for her capabilities. She was ready to grow into something larger, something that their community needed, even if they didn't yet understand what that was. The 7 women joined hands around the altar, and Eleanor felt power flowing between them like electricity. Not the desperate, uncontrolled energy that had led to their downfall, but something focused and purposeful, something that could be shaped into whatever their community needed. The transformation they had begun in secret and shame would now continue in openness and hope. They had been forgiven not just for what they had done wrong, but for what they had failed to become. Now they had the chance to fulfill their true potential, not just as individuals, but as a united force for positive change. As the morning light grew stronger, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something new beginning to take shape within the cold stones of the altar. Not the old flame returning, but something that had never existed before. Something that belonged to this time and these women. Something that could only emerge from the unique combination of their experiences and their choices. The bells of Whitmore House rang one final time that morning, and Eleanor knew that their story was far from over. It was just beginning. The weeks that followed their acceptance of Brother Marcus's offer brought challenges none of them had anticipated. Learning to access powers that had been dormant for generations proved far more difficult than simply breaking traditional rules. Eleanor found herself struggling not with the magnitude of her abilities, but with the precision required to control them. The first lesson came when they attempted to relight the eternal flame using Evangeline's original methods. The ancient text described a process that required all 7 women to channel their individual energies into a unified force. But what seemed simple in writing proved nearly impossible in practice. Mary Thornton's nervous energy kept disrupting the others' concentration. Every time they approached the crucial moment of ignition, her fear would spike and scatter the carefully gathered power like leaves in a windstorm. Rebecca Foster struggled with the opposite problem. Her desire to prove herself worthy led her to try too hard, creating a harsh, burning energy that hurt the others when they tried to link with her spiritually. Margaret Sinclair's brilliant analytical mind worked against her in ways she had never experienced before. She kept trying to understand the process intellectually rather than feeling her way through it intuitively, and her mental interference prevented the deeper spiritual connections from forming properly. Sarah Caldwell, despite her extensive scholarly knowledge, discovered that academic understanding meant little when dealing with forces that responded more to emotion than to logic. Catherine Mills found herself caught between her newly acknowledged heritage and her desire to earn her place through merit rather than bloodline. Anne Davidson, who had remained quietly supportive throughout their trials, revealed depths of spiritual sensitivity that surprised everyone, including herself. She could feel the currents of power flowing between them, could sense exactly where the disruptions occurred, but lacked the confidence to guide the others through the process. Eleanor felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying. The others looked to her for guidance, but she was learning as much as they were, making mistakes that affected them all. When her control slipped during their third attempt, the surge of uncontrolled energy left Mary unconscious for nearly an hour and burned a pattern of symbols into the stone floor that they couldn't erase. Brother Marcus watched their struggles with a mixture of patience and growing concern. He had access to some of Evangeline's personal writings, documents that had been sealed away for decades, but even those provided only limited guidance. Evangeline had been largely self-taught, developing her methods through trial and error over many years. The 7 women were trying to compress that learning process into weeks. The pressure began to affect their relationships in unexpected ways. Rebecca's old jealousies resurfaced when Eleanor's natural leadership became apparent, but now they were complicated by genuine respect and admiration. She found herself caught between wanting to support Eleanor and resenting her own secondary role. Margaret became increasingly frustrated with what she saw as their inefficient approach. She believed that they could accelerate their progress by analyzing the underlying principles more systematically, but her attempts to create structured training exercises only highlighted how little any of them truly understood about what they were trying to accomplish. Mary's fear evolved into something more complex as she began to realize the true magnitude of what they were attempting. The power they were learning to wield could reshape their entire community, but it could also destroy everything they held dear if misused. Her nightmares returned, filled with images of the valley consumed by flames that burned with colors that shouldn't exist. The strain showed in smaller ways as well. Anne began experiencing headaches that seemed to correlate with their practice sessions. Catherine found herself unconsciously adopting mannerisms that reminded everyone of Brother Marcus, creating awkward moments when the others didn't know how to respond to her growing authority. Sarah threw herself into research with an intensity that bordered on obsession, spending hours in the archives trying to find any additional information that might help them succeed. She discovered fragments of correspondence between Evangeline and other spiritual practitioners, hints that their community had once been part of a larger network of people exploring similar abilities. Eleanor felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. During their practice sessions, she could sense the others' hopes and fears as clearly as her own, and the emotional noise made it even harder to achieve the clarity necessary for success. She began taking long walks alone through the valley, trying to find the inner peace that seemed to elude her when surrounded by the others. It was during one of these solitary walks that Eleanor encountered the stranger who would change everything yet again. She found him sitting beside the small stream that ran along the eastern edge of their property. An elderly man with kind eyes and hands that bore the calluses of someone who had spent decades working with stone and metal. He introduced himself as Thomas Ashford, a craftsman who had been traveling through the region when he felt drawn to stop at Whitmore House. As they talked, Eleanor realized that he knew far more about their situation than any outsider should. He spoke casually about the extinguished flame, about the challenges they were facing in their attempts to relight it, about the differences between Evangeline's methods and the diluted traditions that had replaced them. When Eleanor asked how he knew so much, Thomas smiled and rolled up his sleeves. His arms were covered with scars that formed intricate patterns, symbols that Eleanor recognized from her dreams and from the mysterious page that had reappeared in their sacred book. He had been trained by someone who had known Evangeline personally, someone who had preserved the original techniques that had been deliberately obscured over the generations. Thomas offered to help them, but his assistance came with warnings that made Eleanor's stomach clench with anxiety. The powers they were trying to access were dangerous in ways that went far beyond the risk of physical injury. Success would mark them as different from their community in ways that could never be undone. They would gain abilities that would set them apart from ordinary people, possibly forever. More troubling still, Thomas explained that their recent difficulties were not simply the result of inexperience. Something was actively working against them, some force that did not want the eternal flame to burn again. The extinguishing of the flame had been only the beginning of a larger conflict, and their attempts to restore it had drawn the attention of entities that preferred the darkness. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The strange occurrences around Whitmore House, the dreams affecting people in the village, the sense of being watched that had plagued them during their practice sessions. All of these took on new meaning in light of Thomas's words. When she brought Thomas back to meet the others, the reaction was immediate and intense. Mary's intuitive sensitivity allowed her to recognize the truth in his words, but that recognition terrified her. Rebecca was suspicious of his convenient arrival and his extensive knowledge, wondering if he might be connected to whoever had been threatening them from the outside. Margaret was fascinated by the technical aspects of what Thomas described, eager to understand the theoretical framework underlying their practical difficulties. Sarah was excited by the historical connections he represented, the possibility of learning about their tradition's hidden past. Catherine's reaction was the most complex. As Brother Marcus's daughter, she had access to family records that the others had never seen, and some of Thomas's revelations contradicted official accounts of their house's early history. She found herself caught between loyalty to her father's version of events and the compelling evidence that Thomas presented. Anne was the one who asked the question that none of the others wanted to voice. What would happen if they succeeded? If they restored the eternal flame using Evangeline's methods, would they still be the same people they had been before? Would they still belong in the community they were trying to protect? Thomas's answer was brutally honest. Success would transform them in fundamental ways. They would gain abilities that would make them invaluable to their community, but they would also acquire knowledge that would burden them with terrible responsibilities. They would become guardians not just of sacred traditions, but of forces that could reshape the world if they were ever unleashed carelessly. The choice, he said, was theirs to make. They could continue struggling with incomplete methods, possibly succeeding eventually, but remaining vulnerable to the forces working against them. Or they could embrace the full legacy of their tradition, knowing that doing so would change them irrevocably. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of decision settling on her shoulders. The others were looking to her again, waiting for her to choose not just for herself, but for all of them. She thought about the dreams that had brought her to this point, about the sense of destiny that had been growing stronger with each passing day. But before she could respond, Brother Marcus appeared with news that forced their hand. The village below had been experiencing increasingly severe disturbances since the flame went out. Children were having nightmares that left them screaming in terror. Livestock were behaving strangely, refusing to graze in certain areas, and gathering in nervous clusters that served no apparent purpose. Most disturbing of all, 3 villagers had disappeared during the night, vanishing from their homes without any sign of struggle or departure. When search parties were organized, the The searchers found themselves becoming disoriented in familiar territory, wandering in circles until they had to be guided back to safety by others who had remained behind. The protective barrier that the eternal flame had maintained for over 2 centuries was completely gone, and the consequences were spreading beyond Whitmore House to threaten innocent people who had no knowledge of spiritual warfare or supernatural dangers. Eleanor looked around at her companions and saw her own determination reflected in their faces. The choice was no longer theirs to make at their own pace. People were suffering, and they had both the opportunity and the responsibility to help. Thomas nodded approvingly when Eleanor announced their decision. He warned them that the process would be intense and potentially dangerous, but promised to guide them through the most difficult stages. The first step would be to create a proper spiritual foundation, something that would require them to open themselves to levels of vulnerability they had never experienced before. That evening, the 7 women gathered in the sanctuary with Thomas serving as their guide. Brother Marcus and the other brothers formed a protective circle around them, adding their own prayers and spiritual strength to what was about to unfold. Eleanor felt her heart pounding as Thomas began to explain what they needed to do. Each woman would need to release her individual identity temporarily, allowing herself to become part of a larger collective consciousness. They would share not just their spiritual energy, but their memories, fears, hopes, and deepest secrets. For Eleanor, this meant finally letting the others experience the dreams that had shaped her understanding of their mission. For Mary, it meant confronting the terror that had driven so many of her recent choices. Rebecca would have to expose the insecurities that had fueled her jealousy. Margaret would need to acknowledge the control issues that had complicated their earlier attempts. Sarah would share the weight of knowledge that sometimes felt too heavy to bear alone. Catherine would have to reveal the pain of growing up unacknowledged by her father. Anne would need to overcome the shyness that had kept her from contributing more actively to their group. The process began slowly, with simple breathing exercises that helped them synchronize their heart rates and brainwaves. Thomas guided them through progressively deeper levels of meditation, teaching them to recognize the subtle energies that flowed between them, and to gradually lower the barriers that normally kept their individual consciousnesses separate. Eleanor felt the moment when the boundaries began to dissolve. Mary's fear washed over her like a cold tide, but beneath it she could sense the young woman's fierce loyalty and courage. Rebecca's jealousy was there too, but it was paired with a genuine desire to excel that Eleanor found inspiring rather than threatening. Margaret's analytical mind opened like a vast library, sharing insights and connections that Eleanor had never considered. Sarah's accumulated knowledge flowed through the group like a river, carrying information that would have taken any individual years to acquire. Catherine's complex relationship with her heritage became clear to all of them, along with her struggle to define herself independently of her father's expectations. Anne's quiet strength revealed itself as the foundation that had kept them stable through their most difficult moments. As their individual barriers continued to fade, Eleanor began to understand what Evangeline had discovered centuries before. True spiritual power didn't come from individual ability, but from the synergy created when multiple consciousnesses worked in perfect harmony. The reason their earlier attempts had failed wasn't because any of them lacked talent, but because they had been trying to maintain their separateness while pretending to unite. But with understanding came new challenges. As their minds merged more completely, Eleanor found herself experiencing memories that weren't her own. She saw through Mary's eyes as a child, felt Rebecca's pain when she had been passed over for recognition, experienced Margaret's frustration with limitations that seemed arbitrary and pointless. The emotional intensity was overwhelming. Eleanor had to consciously resist the urge to pull back, to restore the comfortable boundaries that protected her from feeling too much. She could sense the others struggling with the same impulse, fighting against instincts that told them this level of openness was dangerous. Thomas's voice seemed to come from very far away as he guided them through the next phase. Now they needed to reach beyond their group consciousness to touch the larger spiritual currents that flowed through their valley. This was where the real danger began, because those currents carried more than just natural energy. Eleanor felt her awareness expanding beyond the sanctuary, beyond Whitmore House itself, reaching out into the valley where she could sense the fear and confusion of the villagers below. But she could also feel something else moving in the darkness, something that definitely did not want their mission to succeed. The opposing presence was ancient and powerful, fed by centuries of accumulated negative emotions, fear, hatred, despair, and the kind of spiritual emptiness that came from losing faith in anything larger than oneself. It had been held at bay by the eternal flame for generations, but now it was free to influence the physical world again. Eleanor could feel this entity pressing against their merged consciousness, looking for weaknesses it could exploit. It whispered doubts and fears directly into their minds, trying to convince each woman that she was inadequate, that the others were judging her, that the attempt was doomed to failure. The attack was subtle but vicious. Eleanor felt Mary's confidence wavering as ancient insecurities were magnified and twisted. Rebecca's jealousy flared as the entity convinced her that Eleanor was deliberately excluding her from the most important decisions. Margaret's analytical mind was flooded with contradictory information that made rational thought nearly impossible. But Eleanor also felt something else, the strength that came from being truly connected to others who understood and accepted her completely. When the entity tried to isolate her with shame about her hidden abilities, she could feel the others' genuine admiration and support. When it whispered that she was too weak to succeed, she drew on the collective determination of her companions. Together, they were stronger than the sum of their individual parts. The entity that had seemed so powerful when they faced it, as separate individuals, found itself confronting a unified force that it couldn't break or corrupt. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he sensed their success in resisting the attack. Now came the most difficult part. They needed to channel their combined strength into the creation of a new eternal flame, one that would be even more powerful than its predecessor, because it was born from conscious choice rather than inherited tradition. Eleanor felt power flowing through her like lightning, but it was controlled lightning, shaped by the collective will of 7 women who had learned to trust each other completely. The energy they generated was unlike anything she had ever experienced, clean and bright, and filled with the kind of hope that could illuminate even the darkest places. The stone altar beneath their hands began to warm. A soft glow appeared at its center, growing stronger as their confidence increased. The new flame that emerged was different from the old one. Instead of pure white light, it burned with subtle colors that shifted and danced like aurora. But as the flame grew brighter, the opposing entity's attacks became more desperate and more dangerous. Eleanor felt it trying to turn their own power against them, to corrupt the flame they were creating by introducing elements of doubt and fear into its essence. This was the moment that would determine their ultimate success or failure. Eleanor knew that she had to make a choice that would affect not just herself, but all of her companions and everyone they were trying to protect. She could play it safe, creating a flame that was strong enough to restore basic protection, but limited enough to avoid provoking further attacks. Or she could embrace the full magnitude of their combined potential, creating something truly extraordinary, but also marking them all as targets for forces that preferred the world to remain dark and hopeless. Eleanor thought about the villagers who were suffering below, about the children whose nightmares would continue if she chose caution over courage. She thought about Evangeline, who had faced a similar choice centuries before and had chosen to risk everything for the chance to make a real difference. The decision was made in an instant, but its consequences would echo through generations. Eleanor opened herself completely to the power flowing through their group, adding her own energy to the collective force they had created. She felt the others making the same choice, one by one, until all 7 women were contributing everything they had to the creation of something unprecedented. The new eternal flame blazed to life with an intensity that filled the entire sanctuary with light. But it was more than just bright. It carried within it the combined hopes, dreams, and determination of 7 women who had chosen to transform themselves rather than accept limitations that no longer served their community. Eleanor felt the opposing entity recoil from the flame's power, but she also sensed its fury and its promise of future conflict. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. By choosing to embrace their full potential, they had marked themselves as permanent enemies of everything that thrived in darkness and despair. As the immediate danger passed and their individual consciousnesses began to separate again, Eleanor looked around at her companions and saw that they had all been changed by the experience. There was a new confidence in Mary's posture, a sense of peace in Rebecca's expression that spoke of jealousies finally laid to rest. Margaret's eyes held the satisfaction of someone who had finally found a challenge worthy of her abilities. Sarah's face glowed with the joy of discovery, of having touched knowledge that went far beyond anything in her books. Catherine stood taller, no longer burdened by the need to prove herself to anyone. Anne smiled with quiet pride, finally understanding the vital role her steady presence had played in their success. And Eleanor felt a sense of completion that she had never experienced before, as if she had finally grown into the person she was always meant to become. But even as they celebrated their success, Eleanor knew that their transformation was only the beginning. The new flame would protect their valley more effectively than the old one ever had, but it would also attract attention from others who possessed similar abilities. Their small community was about to become part of a much larger world, one filled with both wonderful possibilities and terrible dangers. Thomas approached them as they stood around the blazing altar, his weathered face creased with a smile that held both pride and concern. He congratulated them on their success, but warned that the easy part was over. Now they would need to learn to live with the consequences of what they had become, to find ways to use their new abilities responsibly while protecting both themselves and their community from those who would exploit or destroy them. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of new responsibilities settling on her shoulders. But this time, the burden didn't feel overwhelming. She had 6 sisters who would share whatever challenges lay ahead, and together they had already proven that they could accomplish the impossible. The bells of Whitmore House rang out across the valley as news of their success spread through the community. But Eleanor barely heard them. She was listening to something else. The sound of 7 hearts beating in perfect synchronization. The rhythm of a bond that could never be broken. The promise of a future that would be shaped by their choices rather than their limitations. The real work was just beginning, but Eleanor had never felt more ready for what lay ahead. The weeks following their triumph should have been filled with celebration and relief. The new eternal flame burned steadily in the sanctuary, its shifting colors casting patterns of hope throughout Whitmore House. The disturbances in the village had ceased almost immediately, and the missing villagers had been found safe, though they remembered nothing of their disappearance. But Eleanor found herself struggling with unexpected consequences of their success. The deeper spiritual connection she had forged with her companions during the flame's creation hadn't simply disappeared when the ritual ended. She could still sense their emotions, their fears, their dreams, even when they were apart. What had felt like a blessing during their moment of crisis now seemed like an invasion of privacy that she couldn't control. Mary's nightmares woke Eleanor in the middle of the night, even when they were sleeping in different parts of the house. Rebecca's moments of self-doubt created echoes of insecurity in Eleanor's own mind. Margaret's intellectual excitement over their achievement kept Eleanor awake with racing thoughts that weren't her own. The constant emotional noise was exhausting, but Eleanor hesitated to discuss it with the others. They were all adjusting to their own changes, and she didn't want to burden them with her struggles when they had given so much to help her succeed. Thomas had warned them that their transformation would bring unexpected challenges, but he had departed shortly after the flame's creation, saying that his presence might attract unwanted attention to their vulnerable community. Before leaving, he had given Eleanor a small leather journal filled with Evangeline's personal notes, promising that it would help her understand what she was becoming. The journal made for difficult reading. Evangeline's experiences mirrored Eleanor's own in disturbing ways. The enhanced spiritual sensitivity, the inability to shut out others' emotions, the sense of responsibility for everyone around her. All of it was documented in Evangeline's careful handwriting, along with her struggles to find balance between her abilities and her humanity. But the journal also contained warnings that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Evangeline wrote about the isolation that came with power, about the way other people began to see her as something other than human. She described the gradual erosion of normal relationships as friends and family became either fearful of her abilities or determined to exploit them for their own purposes. Most troubling of all were Evangeline's final entries, written shortly before her death. She had begun to question whether the power she wielded was worth the price it demanded, not just from her but from everyone around her. She wondered if she had become more of a burden to her community than a blessing, if the protection she provided was worth the constant tension her presence created. Eleanor was reading these final passages when Brother Marcus summoned her to his private study. She found him standing before a window that looked out over the valley, his expression more troubled than she had ever seen it. He turned to face her as she entered, and Eleanor was shocked by how much he seemed to have aged in the past few weeks. His hair had become noticeably grayer, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Brother Marcus told her that representatives from the Central Council were coming to investigate their situation. Word of the flame's restoration had spread beyond their valley, along with rumors about the methods they had used to achieve it. The council was concerned about the precedent they might be setting, about the possibility that other communities might attempt similar transformations without proper oversight. Eleanor felt her heart sinking as Brother Marcus continued his explanation. The council representatives weren't coming to congratulate them on their success. They were coming to determine whether the 7 women had violated fundamental principles of their order, whether their actions constituted a dangerous deviation from established traditions. If the council decided against them, the consequences would be severe. The women could be stripped of their positions and exiled from all houses of their order. Worse still, they might be required to undergo a ritual of spiritual severing that would cut them off from their abilities permanently, leaving them as ordinary humans with no memory of what they had accomplished. The irony was bitter. They had succeeded in protecting their community and restoring the sacred flame, but their very success had marked them as threats to the larger organization they had served faithfully for years. Eleanor asked what Brother Marcus recommended, hoping that his support might carry weight with the council representatives. His response devastated her. He told her that he had been placed in an impossible position. As Catherine's father and the spiritual leader of their community, he wanted to defend what they had accomplished. But as a member of the council himself, he was bound by oaths that required him to report any deviations from approved practices. He had already submitted his official report about their activities, a document that laid out the facts without editorial comment, but that would likely be interpreted as evidence of serious violations. He could not advocate for them during the investigation without compromising his own position and potentially making their situation worse. Eleanor left the meeting feeling as if the ground had been cut out from beneath her feet. Everything they had sacrificed and suffered to achieve was about to be stripped away by the very people they had sworn to serve. The flame they had created would probably be extinguished and replaced with a conventional one. Their enhanced abilities would be severed. Their bond with each other would be broken. That evening, Eleanor gathered her 6 companions in the small room where they had once been confined during their punishment. She told them about the council's investigation, about Brother Marcus's position, about the likely consequences they faced. The reactions were as varied as the women themselves. Mary broke down in tears, not for herself but for the villagers who had benefited from their protection. Rebecca flew into a rage, declaring that she would rather face exile than submit to having her abilities stripped away. Margaret began immediately analyzing their options, looking for legal precedents or procedural loopholes that might save them. Sarah retreated into herself, devastated by the thought that their actions might be judged as violations of principles she had spent her life studying and defending. Catherine struggled with divided loyalties, torn between her commitment to her sisters and her love for her father. But it was Anne's reaction that surprised Eleanor the most. The quiet woman who had always seemed content to follow others' lead stood up and spoke with a strength that none of them had heard from her before. She said that she was tired of being afraid, tired of allowing others to define the boundaries of what they could become. Anne reminded them that they had already been punished once for breaking rules, and that punishment had led them to discover their true potential. Perhaps this new challenge was simply another step in their journey, another opportunity to choose growth over safety. Her words sparked something in Eleanor that had been dormant since Brother Marcus's devastating news. Anne was right. They had a choice to make, just as they had chosen to embrace their transformation rather than accept exile or spiritual severing. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the valley they had protected, at the village where children now slept peacefully because of their sacrifice. She thought about Evangeline, who had faced similar challenges and had chosen to stand by her principles even when it cost her everything. When Eleanor turned back to face her companions, she saw her own determination reflected in their faces. They had come too far to surrender now, had learned too much about their own capabilities to accept artificial limitations imposed by others' fears. Eleanor proposed something that would have seemed impossible just months before. Instead of waiting passively for the council's judgment, they would present their case actively. They would demonstrate the value of what they had accomplished, show the council representatives exactly what their enhanced abilities could achieve for the good of their entire order. It was a dangerous gamble. If they succeeded in convincing the council, they might not only save themselves but open new possibilities for other communities struggling with similar challenges. If they failed, their defiance would likely result in the harshest possible punishment. But Eleanor realized that she was no longer the same woman who had once sought safety in obedience and conformity. The experiences of the past months had taught her that real security came not from following rules, but from having the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult. The 7 women spent the next 2 days preparing for the council's arrival. They practiced demonstrating their abilities in ways that would highlight their protective rather than destructive potential. They compiled evidence of the positive changes their actions had brought to their community. Most importantly, they prepared themselves emotionally for the possibility of total rejection. Eleanor found herself drawing strength from the others in ways she had never experienced before. Mary's fierce determination to protect innocent people, inspired Eleanor's own courage. Rebecca's willingness to fight for what she believed in reminded Eleanor that some things were worth any sacrifice. Margaret's brilliant analysis of their situation helped Eleanor understand the larger implications of their choices. Sarah's deep knowledge of their order's history provided context that made their actions seem like natural evolution rather than dangerous innovation. Catherine's struggle with divided loyalties helped Eleanor appreciate the complexity of change, the way progress sometimes required people to choose between different forms of loyalty. Anne's quiet strength reminded Eleanor that real power often came from unexpected sources. When the council representatives arrived, Eleanor was struck by how ordinary they seemed. She had expected intimidating figures radiating authority and judgment, but instead found three middle-aged individuals who looked tired and somewhat uncertain about their mission. The leader of the delegation was Sister Patricia Blackwood, a woman roughly Eleanor's age who had gained a reputation for fairness and careful judgment. The other two were Brother James Hartley, an expert in traditional practices, and Sister Margaret Rothwell, a scholar specializing in the historical development of their order's rules and customs. The investigation began formally in the main hall, with all 7 women kneeling before the representatives as Brother Marcus read the charges against them. Eleanor listened to the list of their alleged violations and felt a strange sense of detachment. The actions being described were technically accurate, but they bore little resemblance to the spiritual journey that had brought them to this point. When Sister Blackwood asked Eleanor to explain their actions, Eleanor chose honesty over diplomacy. She told the complete story, from her childhood dreams to their final transformation, holding nothing back. She described their failures and mistakes alongside their achievements, their fears alongside their hopes. The 3 representatives listened without interruption, but Eleanor could sense their growing unease as her account progressed. What she was describing challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of spiritual authority and the role of individual initiative within their order. When Eleanor finished her testimony, Sister Blackwood asked to speak with each of the other women individually. Eleanor waited anxiously as her companions were questioned, hoping that they would find the courage to tell their own truths rather than simply providing the answers they thought the council wanted to hear. Mary spoke about her journey from fear to courage, about learning that true strength came from accepting help rather than trying to face challenges alone. Rebecca described her struggle with jealousy and how working together had taught her that success was more meaningful when it was shared. Margaret explained her discovery that real wisdom required both intellectual understanding and emotional intelligence, that the most important truths couldn't be found in books alone. Sarah shared her realization that traditions needed to evolve in order to remain relevant, that preservation sometimes required transformation. Catherine spoke about the pain of growing up unacknowledged and how learning to work as part of a team had taught her that individual accomplishments meant little without connection to others. Anne surprised everyone by speaking passionately about the importance of finding her own voice, of contributing to solutions rather than simply accepting whatever others decided. The questioning continued for 2 full days, with the representatives examining every aspect of their transformation and its consequences. They interviewed Brother Marcus about his observations, spoke with villagers about the changes they had experienced, and conducted their own spiritual examination of the new eternal flame. Eleanor found the waiting unbearable. She could sense the emotional turmoil of her companions, their mixture of hope and dread as they waited for a judgment that would determine the rest of their lives. The enhanced connection she shared with them meant that she experienced their anxiety as intensely as her own, creating a feedback loop of stress that left her feeling raw and exhausted. On the final morning of the investigation, Sister Blackwood called all 7 women back to the main hall for the council's decision. Eleanor knelt with her companions, trying to prepare herself for whatever was about to come. Sister Blackwood's expression was unreadable as she began to speak. She acknowledged the technical violations of established rules and procedures, the risks they had taken with forces they didn't fully understand, the precedent their actions might set for other communities. But then her tone shifted. She spoke about the undeniable positive outcomes of their choices, the protection they had restored to their community, the growth they had achieved both individually and as a group. She noted that their enhanced abilities had been used exclusively for protective purposes, that they had shown remarkable restraint and wisdom in how they wielded their new power. Most significantly, Sister Blackwood revealed that the Central Council had been struggling with similar challenges in other communities throughout their region. Traditional methods were proving inadequate to address spiritual threats that seemed to be growing stronger and more sophisticated. The 7 women's success in developing new approaches represented hope for addressing these larger problems. The council's decision was unlike anything Eleanor had expected. Rather than punishment or exile, they were being offered a choice. They could return to traditional practices, accepting positions of honor within their order, but agreeing to never again use the enhanced abilities they had developed. Or they could accept a new role as pioneers, working with the council to develop and test innovative approaches that might benefit their entire order. The second option came with significant risks and responsibilities. They would be closely monitored, required to document their methods carefully, and held accountable for any negative consequences of their actions. They would also be separated from the comfortable certainty of traditional practices, forced to navigate uncharted territory with only their own judgment as a guide. Eleanor looked around at her companions and saw her own answer reflected in their faces. They had come too far to turn back now, learned too much about their own potential to accept artificial limitations. They would accept the council's offer and embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. Sister Blackwood smiled as Eleanor announced their decision. She revealed that she had hoped they would choose the more difficult path, that the council needed people with their combination of ability and wisdom to help guide their order through the changes that were coming. The ceremony that followed was unlike any traditional ritual Eleanor had ever experienced. Instead of simply reaffirming existing vows, they were creating new commitments that acknowledged both their enhanced abilities and their responsibilities to use them wisely. As Eleanor spoke her new vows, she felt a profound sense of completion. The scared young woman who had once hidden her abilities and dreams was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to embrace her full potential while remaining connected to the people she served. The other women experienced their own moments of transformation during the ceremony. Mary's voice grew stronger as she pledged to use her sensitivity to protect others rather than simply enduring her own fear. Rebecca promised to channel her competitive nature into collaborative achievement rather than destructive rivalry. Margaret committed to using her analytical abilities to solve problems that benefited everyone rather than simply advancing her own understanding. Sarah vowed to pursue knowledge that could be shared and applied rather than hoarded for its own sake. Catherine pledged to honor both her heritage and her chosen family, using her unique position to bridge different perspectives rather than allowing them to divide her. Anne promised to continue finding her voice, to contribute her insights rather than assuming that others always knew better. When the ceremony ended, Eleanor felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. The enhanced connection she shared with her companions was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it had become a source of strength, a reminder that she was never truly alone as long as they remained committed to supporting each other. Brother Marcus approached them after the council representatives had departed, his expression complex, but no longer troubled. He told Eleanor that he was proud of what they had accomplished, that watching their growth had reminded him why he had chosen his calling in the first place. Catherine's relationship with her father would never be simple, but Eleanor could see that it was finally honest. He acknowledged her as his daughter not because of her bloodline, but because she had earned recognition through her choices and actions. In the days that followed, life at Whitmore House settled into new rhythms. The 7 women continued their traditional duties, but they also began developing the training programs and documentation that would allow others to benefit from what they had learned. Eleanor found herself corresponding with sacred keepers from other communities, sharing insights and learning about challenges that she had never imagined. The sense of isolation that had once defined her spiritual journey was replaced by awareness of a larger community of people working towards similar goals. The enhanced abilities that had once seemed like burdens became tools for service. Eleanor's sensitivity to others' emotions allowed her to provide guidance and support with unprecedented effectiveness. Mary's intuitive awareness helped identify spiritual disturbances before they could cause serious damage. Rebecca's competitive nature drove her to constantly improve their methods and achieve better results. Margaret's analytical approach helped them understand the theoretical foundations of what they were doing, making it possible to teach others more effectively. Sarah's scholarship allowed them to place their innovations within the larger context of their order's development, showing how change and growth had always been essential elements of their tradition. Catherine's unique heritage gave her credibility with traditionalists who might otherwise resist new approaches. Anne's quiet wisdom provided stability and perspective when the challenges they faced seemed overwhelming. Her example reminded them all that real leadership often came from those who served others rather than seeking recognition for themselves. As spring returned to their valley, Eleanor stood once again in the sanctuary where the new eternal flame burned with its shifting, hopeful colors. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, about the price they had all paid for the growth they had achieved. The woman who had once knelt in this same space, trembling with fear and shame, seemed like a stranger now. Eleanor had learned that redemption wasn't about returning to innocence, but about transforming guilt and failure into wisdom and strength. She had discovered that forgiveness wasn't something that others granted, but something that had to be earned through the choice to become better than who she had been before. The council hadn't absolved them of their mistakes. They had simply recognized that those mistakes had led to growth that benefited everyone. Most importantly, Eleanor had learned that real power came not from individual ability, but from the connections that bound people together in common purpose. The enhanced spiritual gifts she possessed were meaningful only because she shared them with others who understood their true value. As she stood before the flame they had created together, Eleanor felt the presence of her 6 sisters even though they were scattered throughout the house pursuing their various duties. The bond they had forged could never be broken, because it was based on mutual choice rather than obligation or convenience. The bells of Whitmore House rang out across the valley, calling people to evening prayers as they had for generations. But now those bells carried a new message of hope and possibility, a promise that growth and change were always possible for those who had the courage to embrace them. Eleanor smiled as she listened to the familiar sound, knowing that their story was far from over. There would be new challenges ahead, new opportunities to serve and to grow. But whatever came next, she would face it with the confidence that came from knowing who she truly was and what she was capable of becoming. The 7 women who had once knelt in shame and fear had risen to become something their community needed, something the world needed. They had learned that what seemed abominable in the moment could become the foundation for something beautiful, if people were willing to do the hard work of transformation. Their journey from disgrace to redemption had taught them the most important lesson of all, that forgiveness and growth were always possible, but only for those who were willing to pay the price in humility, courage, and genuine change. As darkness fell over their valley, Eleanor made her way back to her quarters, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from a day well spent in service to others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she had finally become the person she was meant to be. The eternal flame continued to burn behind her, its light reaching out to touch every corner of their community with hope and protection. It would burn for generations to come, tended by those who understood that true service required not blind obedience, but the wisdom to know when tradition needed to evolve, and the courage to guide that evolution responsibly. Eleanor's dreams that night were peaceful, filled with visions of the future they were building together. In those dreams, she saw other communities learning from their example, other individuals finding the courage to embrace their full potential, other groups discovering the power that came from genuine unity and shared purpose. What they had done might have seemed abominable to those who valued conformity over growth, but Eleanor knew that sometimes the most important changes began with actions that challenged comfortable assumptions. They had learned to transform their shame into strength, their failures into wisdom, their individual limitations into collective power. The bells of Whitmore House would continue to ring, calling people to remember that redemption was always possible for those who were willing to do the work of becoming better than they had been before. And in that sanctuary where the new eternal flame burned with colors that had never been seen before, 7 women had proven that even the most devastating mistakes could become the foundation for extraordinary grace.